Can a single individual truly alter the destiny of an entire nation? In the tumultuous 19th century, the United States found itself engulfed in a profound crisis, one that threatened to irrevocably tear the young country apart. A nation famously founded on the lofty ideals of freedom and self-governance was, paradoxically, deeply cleaved by the institution of slavery. Tensions escalated ominously, and the burgeoning republic teetered precariously on the precipice of a devastating civil war. Amidst this gathering storm, an unlikely figure emerged from obscurity. Abraham Lincoln, a politician forged in the crucible of poverty, would ultimately rise to guide the country through its absolute darkest hour. But before we delve deeper into his extraordinary journey, please remember to subscribe to the Past Chronicle. Afterward, we'd love for you to leave a comment and share which other historical leaders you're eager to learn more about. All right, Lincoln, the nation truly needs you now. Let us embark on this remarkable story. In the mid-19th century, the United States outwardly projected the image of a dynamic and expansive young nation, brimming with energy and ambition. Its urban centers were flourishing, and railroads aggressively pushed the frontier westward. Millions of immigrants streamed in each year, drawn by the irresistible promise of opportunity and a new beginning. From an external perspective, the country appeared to be a vibrant and exceptionally promising democracy. Yet, beneath that optimistic and bustling surface, a profound and dangerous fracture lay concealed. Two utterly divergent visions for the nation were on a collision course. In the northern states, the economy was rapidly embracing industrialization. Slavery had, for the most part, vanished there decades prior, and citizens began to perceive it as a grave moral contradiction. In stark contrast, the Southern economy was inextricably built upon the institution of slavery. Vast cotton plantations thrived only through the coerced labor of millions of enslaved people. For many influential Southern leaders, this deeply entrenched system was not merely economically necessary. It was considered a fundamental aspect of their society that demanded protection and expansion. This underlying tension had simmered beneath the surface since the very inception of the United States. But by now, it had reached a perilous critical mass. Each new territory seeking admission to the Union inevitably ignited the same incendiary question: would it be designated a free state or a slave state? Beyond this heated political debate, a much more fundamental conflict raged. It wasn't simply about economic interests. It was about the very essence and meaning of freedom itself in a land of liberty. The Declaration of Independence had boldly articulated a revolutionary idea: that all men were created equal. Despite this powerful assertion, millions of individuals within the nation remained brutally enslaved. For many decades, political leaders had carefully skirted this agonizing contradiction, choosing to avoid a direct confrontation. They largely favored political compromises or a strategic, often convenient, silence. Yet, with each passing generation, the moral and practical weight of this hypocrisy became increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to ignore. It was in this intensely charged atmosphere that an unlikely figure stepped onto the national stage. Abraham Lincoln did not hail from an influential family or a prominent urban center. He was born into profound poverty in a rustic log cabin in Kentucky. He lacked the polished, classical education and the influence of powerful elites characteristic of his contemporaries. Even his physical appearance did little to enhance his political image. He was remarkably tall, slender, with a strikingly angular face and an unrefined, somewhat high-pitched voice. Nevertheless, hidden beneath that unassuming exterior lay an extraordinarily acute and analytical mind. Lincoln possessed a rare gift for distilling complex problems down to their most fundamental moral principles. When he spoke, he did not rely on florid, grandiose speeches. Instead, he preferred to communicate through relatable stories and clear, logical reasoning that any citizen could readily grasp. For years, his political career had been marked by inconsistency. He had won some elections, but lost many more. In fact, he himself was led to believe that his political life had been a failure. Meanwhile, another towering figure dominated the national landscape, Stephen Douglas. Douglas was everything Lincoln was not: charismatic, immensely influential, and celebrated across the entire country. However, fate was meticulously orchestrating a momentous confrontation between these two men. This clash would become the pivotal stage upon which the United States would determine if it could continue to exist. Very soon, these two formidable opponents would face each other in a series of debates that would seize the attention of the entire country. Those impassioned debates would ultimately mark the genesis of a path that would forever reshape the course of United States history. For sometimes, the grandest transformations are initiated not by armies, but by the potent power of words. In the summer months, as the nation's tensions grew almost palpable, two men embarked on a remarkable journey across the state of Illinois, confronting each other before massive crowds. This was not a duel with swords, yet the stakes were immensely higher. What hung in the balance could determine the very future of the entire country. Douglas arrived at each venue as the veritable superstar of American politics. He traveled in luxurious comfort, surrounded by a retinue of assistants and supporters who cheered him like a conquering champion. Lincoln, in stark contrast, often arrived in a far more humble fashion. At times, he would walk considerable distances or utilize much simpler, more common modes of transportation. His distinctively tall, lanky figure offered a striking visual counterpoint to the polished, almost regal political presence of his rival. But once they began to speak, the dynamics shifted entirely. Thousands gathered to witness intellectual confrontations that frequently stretched on for several intense hours. The atmosphere was electrifying, often compared to a modern-day sporting event. The reason was simple. They were debating the profoundly divisive and deeply moral issue of slavery. Stephen Douglas passionately championed popular sovereignty. He argued that each new territory should possess the inherent right to decide for itself whether to permit or prohibit slavery. Lincoln perceived a fundamental problem embedded within that argument. If slavery was inherently and morally wrong, he posited, how could such a grave injustice simply be put to a popular vote? It was during these seminal debates that Lincoln began to articulate an idea that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of his political career. He boldly declared that the United States could not permanently endure as a nation perpetually divided. He uttered the words that would echo across the nation: "A house divided against itself cannot stand." With that prophetic phrase, Lincoln suggested that the nation was grappling with an irreconcilable contradiction that would eventually demand a definitive resolution or risk self-destruction. Douglas attacked Lincoln's stance with fierce determination. He vehemently accused Lincoln and his allies of harboring intentions to impose complete racial equality across the country. He dramatically warned the public that if Lincoln were to win, it would inevitably lead to black citizens exercising the right to vote and even serving on juries. Lincoln defended his position with meticulous care. While he held certain racial prejudices common to the 19th century, he steadfastly insisted that if a person was a human being, they inherently possessed a natural right to freedom. Lincoln skillfully employed a simple yet powerful logic. He continually invoked the Declaration of Independence, reminding people that the nation was established upon the revolutionary idea of equality for all. The debates rapidly evolved into a national phenomenon. Newspapers published complete transcripts, and citizens across the entire country eagerly discussed the ideas presented by both men. When the time finally arrived for the votes to be tallied, Lincoln ultimately lost the election. Douglas successfully retained his seat in the Senate. For many, such a defeat would have signaled the end of a career. But in Lincoln's case, the debates had transformed him into a recognized national figure. Millions of citizens now knew his name and respected his ability to articulate his ideas. The defeat, unexpectedly, had opened an unforeseen door to greater prominence. Very soon, That door would lead him to a far more consequential election, one that would trigger the greatest political crisis the United States had ever confronted. By the time Abraham Lincoln formally announced his candidacy for president, the country was already teetering perilously close to irreversible fragmentation. Tensions between the industrializing North and the agrarian South had intensified. Debates over slavery had metastasized into profound conflicts that now overtly threatened to tear the nation apart. It was within this volatile context that Abraham Lincoln's name began to gain momentum within the newly formed Republican Party. He certainly wasn't the most famous politician in the country, nor was he the most well-connected. But he possessed a quality many other candidates lacked. In his debates with Douglas, he had demonstrated an unparalleled ability to clearly explain the moral problem of slavery without resorting to extreme, divisive rhetoric. When the Republican Party ultimately selected him, the slaveholding South reacted with immediate and profound alarm. For Southern leaders, Lincoln symbolized a direct threat to the very system that underpinned their entire economy, social structure, and political power. Although Lincoln had not proposed immediately abolishing slavery where it already existed, he firmly and unequivocally opposed its expansion into any new territories. For the fervent supporters of slavery, this unwavering stance was utterly unacceptable and a direct challenge to their entire way of life. Throughout the presidential campaign, several Southern states began issuing explicit warnings. They declared that if Lincoln were to win the election, they would formally secede from the country. Despite these grave threats, the election proceeded. In the North, Lincoln garnered massive support, while in many Southern states, his name didn't even appear on the ballot. When the results were finally tallied, the news swiftly disseminated via the telegraph wires. Abraham Lincoln had won the presidency of the United States. Instead of national celebrations, what followed was a reaction of profound rupture. In South Carolina, political leaders promptly convened a convention to deliberate the state's future. Within a mere few weeks, they made the decision to formally leave the Union. One by one, 7 states announced their secession and began organizing a new government, the Confederate States of America. The country stood on the very brink of war. While all these monumental events unfolded, Lincoln had not yet officially assumed office. During this precarious interim, he needed to travel from Illinois to Washington, D.C., but the journey itself would prove anything but simple. Tensions were so high that chilling rumors began to circulate about assassination attempts, specifically a plot to attack him as his train passed through Baltimore. Detectives launched an investigation and uncovered a dangerous conspiracy. The solution was drastic. Lincoln would be compelled to travel in absolute secrecy. He boarded a clandestine night train, passing through several major cities without public announcement. At times, he even resorted to using simple disguises to avoid recognition. When he finally arrived in Washington under the cloak of secrecy, many newspapers mocked him, accusing him of cowardice. But Lincoln understood something that many others still did not grasp. The nation that had proudly promised freedom to all was now poised to confront itself in a cataclysmic war. When Abraham Lincoln finally assumed the responsibilities of the presidency, several Southern states had not only departed, but had also formed their own sovereign government. War, an unthinkable prospect just years before, now seemed terrifyingly inevitable. Initially, many Americans harbored a belief that the impending conflict would be remarkably brief. Some believed the North would quickly crush the rebellion. Others were certain the South would assert its independence within weeks. No one truly grasped the horrific scale of what was about to unfold. The first major confrontation took place in a rural region of Virginia known as Manassas. A small stream, Bull Run, lent its name to the eventual battlefield. Thousands of soldiers from both sides marched confidently toward the clash. Most were eager volunteers who had barely received training, convinced the war would be over before their service expired. From Washington, D.C., a multitude of civilians also traveled to witness the battle. Politicians and families arrived in their carriages with picnic baskets and opera glasses, as if attending a theatrical show. It was an almost surreal scene. Tragic as it was, many still failed to comprehend the brutal reality of what a modern, industrial-scale war truly entailed. At the outset, Union forces appeared to hold the advantage. Northern soldiers managed to successfully push back several Confederate units throughout the morning hours. In Washington, Lincoln anxiously awaited news in the telegraph office. The initial messages seemed promising, fueling a cautious optimism. But as the afternoon wore on, the tide shifted. Confederate reinforcements arrived efficiently by railroad, an innovative development that was beginning to transform military logistics. Confederate fighters unleashed a terrifying, high-pitched war cry, a chilling scream that resonated across the battlefield. Union soldiers later described it as almost supernatural. The battle quickly descended into utter chaos. Union lines began to break under the pressure, and the orderly retreat devolved into a disordered, full-blown rout. The civilian spectators who had arrived for the spectacle suddenly found themselves trapped in the midst of the disaster. Overturned carriages and terrified civilians crowded the narrow roads in a scene of pandemonium. For Lincoln, the consequences were immediate and painful. Defeated Union soldiers began to trickle back into the capital, utterly exhausted, wounded, and demoralized. For the very first time, the abstract concept of war ceased to be an intellectual idea. It now had tangible faces, grievous wounds, and the grim reality of funerals. That day, Lincoln experienced a profound realization. The war would not conclude quickly. It would be a protracted, brutal, and deeply transformative conflict. The president began meticulously preparing for a total war. A war that would demand new armies, innovative strategies, and bold political decisions that could change the fate of millions. Among those decisions, one idea was beginning to solidify in his mind. Could the country truly win this war without finally confronting the issue of slavery? As the war relentlessly progressed, each devastating battle left thousands dead. The conflict stretched on, and the nation began to question how much longer it could endure such immense loss. From the genesis of the conflict, abolitionists insisted the war be reframed as a direct fight against slavery. They argued the rebellion could not be separated from the system that sustained it. However, Lincoln recognized that the situation was politically perilous. Even in the North, many citizens did not desire a war specifically to free enslaved people. Their priority was simply to preserve the Union. If Lincoln acted too radically, he risked losing crucial support. If he acted too late, he would betray the fundamental moral principle that many believed was at stake. Meanwhile, in the South, slavery had evolved into a direct tool of war. Enslaved people were forcibly conscripted to build fortifications and transport supplies for the Confederate Army. Union strategists highlighted a compelling idea. If those enslaved people were freed, the South would lose its labor force, while the North could gain new, invaluable recruits. Lincoln began to seriously consider employing his powers as commander-in-chief to take a revolutionary step. This would not merely be a moral measure, but a decisive military strategy. For months, Lincoln discussed this monumental idea with his cabinet. Many seasoned politicians warned him that such a radical decision could cost him the presidency or ignite civil unrest. But the president understood that if the war concluded without resolving slavery, the country would remain divided forever, merely deferring the inevitable confrontation. Following the Battle of Antietam, one of the bloodiest confrontations of the war, Lincoln found the critical political opportunity he had been patiently waiting for. With unwavering resolve, he announced what would forever become one of the most important documents in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation. The document declared that all enslaved people in territories controlled by the Confederacy would be, from that moment forward, set free. While this did not immediately free every enslaved person in the country, it irrevocably altered the fundamental purpose of the war. It was now a fight for the universal principle of freedom. Reaction was immediate and divided. Many in the North celebrated the decision as a long overdue step toward justice. African American communities organized fervent gatherings and jubilant celebrations. But others reacted with anger. Some politicians accused Lincoln of transforming the war into an ideological crusade, far beyond its original scope. Lincoln was cognizant of these risks but did not waver. On the day he was to officially sign the document, his hand was visibly tired and slightly trembling from a long reception. For a brief, poignant moment, he hesitated, not because of the document's content, but because he feared a shaky signature might betray the immense gravity of the moment. He waited until his hand became steady. Then, with a firm resolve, he took up the pen and signed the Emancipation Proclamation. With that single gesture, millions were officially declared free. The man who had sought primarily to preserve the Union was now guiding a profound moral transformation. As the years dragged on, battles multiplied with gruesome regularity. The grim number of dead soared at a terrifying pace, forever scarring the nation. Early portraits of Lincoln show a man already serious, but photographs taken just a few years later reveal a visibly aged man, with deep lines of profound exhaustion etched into his gaunt face. Beyond leading a divided country, Lincoln frequently penned personal letters to families who had lost sons or husbands, making an empathetic attempt to offer solace. Tragedy also struck his personal life with the death of his beloved son, Willie. This personal sorrow blended with crushing political pressures, creating an almost unbearable emotional burden. Even amidst such anguish, Lincoln steadfastly kept working. Every day, he confronted new military decisions, political pressures, and a barrage of public criticism. Lincoln was undergoing an internal transformation. He started to view the war as a divine crucible, compelling the country to finally confront the moral problem of slavery it had long evaded. He mused that the unimaginable duration of the war might be a form of collective divine punishment for the nation's profound moral failing. It was no longer simply about winning the war. It was about fundamentally redefining the very meaning and purpose of the American nation itself. Throughout the country, cities filled with makeshift hospitals, while cemeteries expanded grimly. Lincoln understood that as each day passed, the responsibility rested squarely on his shoulders. If the country was to endure such suffering, he reasoned, then it had to be for something immeasurably greater, the forging of a more just nation. Gradually, the balance of power began to shift. Union forces started to gain ground decisively, and the long-awaited end of the conflict finally began to appear on the horizon. Lincoln prepared to deliver his second inaugural address. Many expected a triumphant speech, speaking only of glorious victory or swift punishment for the rebellious states. However, Lincoln deliberately chose a different tone. When he stepped onto the platform, his voice was calm and his words were notably devoid of any vengeful sentiment. He reminded the audience that both sides had expected a short conflict. Both had prayed to the same God and believed, with fervent conviction, that they were righteous. Lincoln suggested the war might be a moral consequence for the pervasive evil of slavery. For over 2 centuries, millions have been forced to toil, their labor building a vast, unjust wealth. His words were aimed at beginning the arduous process of reconciling a broken nation. He articulated a profound idea that would define his vision for the future. There should be no lingering hatred, he declared. The goal should be to heal the nation's wounds, with malice toward none, with charity for all. The nation needed to rebuild not merely its shattered cities, but its very spirit. That address transcended politics. It was a fundamental redefinition of the war's ultimate purpose. Lincoln was stating that the conflict had been a fight to confront historical injustice. Meanwhile, the 13th Amendment was rapidly unfolding to permanently abolish slavery throughout the United States. The country founded on a Declaration of Freedom was finally eliminating its greatest contradiction. Lincoln had achieved something that for decades had seemed utterly impossible. But even as the nation began to imagine a future of peace, Fate was preparing an unforeseen tragedy. Only a few short days after victory, the president would face a brutal end. The war had, at long last, finally ended. Confederate forces had officially surrendered, and the United States was cautiously beginning to emerge from its bloodiest conflict. For the first time in an eternity, Lincoln appeared genuinely relaxed. On April 14th, he spoke joyfully to his wife Mary about his ambitious plans for Reconstruction. That evening, Lincoln planned to attend Ford's Theater to watch a comedy play. When he entered the presidential box, the audience spontaneously rose to their feet with a resounding ovation. It was a symbolic moment. The man who had guided the country through its greatest crisis was now being celebrated by a profoundly grateful nation. But somewhere hidden within the theater, John Wilkes Booth was patiently biding his time. Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, was consumed by a twisted conviction that he had to avenge the South's loss. In the midst of a particularly loud scene, when the audience's laughter filled the room, Booth silently entered the box and fired a single, deafening shot. The President of the United States had been mortally wounded. Chaos erupted instantaneously as unadulterated panic spread like wildfire throughout the entire theater. Lincoln was carried to a nearby boarding house, where doctors labored tirelessly through the night. The following morning, on April 15, 1865, the beloved president tragically died. The news spread like a wave of shock across the country. Never before had a United States president been assassinated while still in office. National mourning was immediate and profound. Church bells tolled mournfully, and flags across the nation were lowered to half-staff as the country came to a sorrowful standstill. Lincoln's body was placed on a funeral train that traveled across the country. In every town, massive, silent crowds gathered by the tracks to pay their final respects to the fallen leader. For countless citizens, Lincoln embodied the possibility that a humble individual could rise to the highest office and fundamentally alter the course of history. He had carried on his shoulders the burden of a war that threatened to tear the nation apart. Against all odds, he managed to preserve the Union and transform its moral purpose. The story of Abraham Lincoln was the story of a country that bravely confronted its greatest contradiction and chose decisively to transform itself. His life stands as a testament that history is not exclusively written by those born into power or wealth. Sometimes it depends on individuals driven by an unshakable conviction. Lincoln was not a perfect man, but he possessed the extraordinary courage to evolve in his thinking and to act decisively when the fate of the country demanded it. In the midst of civil war, he made decisions that redefined the meaning of freedom. He transformed a political conflict into a profound moral struggle. That is why his story continues to resonate deeply across the globe. It demonstrates that even in the most fragile of democracies, the ideas of freedom and equality can indeed prevail. Abraham Lincoln did not merely help save his country. He helped to profoundly redefine what that country was inherently meant to be. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any future stories. We'll see you in the next video.